Hook, imagine being so hungry that the line between food and not food completely disappears. In medieval Europe, people ate things so bizarre, you'd swear they came from a survival horror story. Chapter 1. Hunger in the Dark Ages, when food became desperation. Imagine waking up in a world where your stomach decides more about your destiny than your king ever could. A world where one bad storm, one failed harvest, or one greedy lord could mean the difference between life and starvation. This was medieval Europe, where hunger wasn't an inconvenience. It was a constant shadow. To understand why people ate things we would never dare touch today, you first have to step into their world. Not the romanticized version with chivalrous knights and bustling markets, but the real one. The mud-stained villages, freezing huts, and endless uncertainty that shaped everyday life. Most medieval peasants lived on a razor's edge. A typical family had one small plot of land, maybe a few chickens if they were lucky, and a back-breaking dependence on the weather. There was no supermarket to restock, no government safety net, no emergency storage. Hunger came fast, and when it arrived it didn't feel like the kind of hunger you and I know. It wasn't, "I skipped lunch today." It was the deep, aching kind that twists your insides and makes people act in ways they never imagined. And then came the famines. Crops rotted, animals died in the fields, grain supplies disappeared. People starved along the roads. Chronicles describe travelers collapsing mid-journey because they simply didn't have the energy to walk another mile. Entire families survived on nothing but boiled weeds. Some didn't survive at all. And when famine hit, society didn't collapse into chaos right away. It crumbled slowly, layer by layer. First, people used up what little food they had stored. Then they slaughtered the animals. Then they turned to things they would normally ignore: bark, mushrooms, moss, frogs, whatever nature offered. But sometimes nature offered nothing. You're thinking about the harsh winter ahead, and whether you can survive it. You're thinking about living long enough to see the next harvest. Food became survival. Survival became instinct. Instinct silenced disgust. People learned to eat things that weren't really food at all, things that modern humans would never imagine putting in their mouths. But it wasn't only famine that created bizarre eating habits. Medieval life was unpredictable even in normal years. Meat was incredibly expensive. Fresh fruits were seasonal luxuries. Most people lived on thick bread, watery pottage, and whatever they could forage in the forests. If a village was under siege by an enemy army, months could pass with no food entering the walls. Siege diaries are filled with jaw-dropping accounts of what starving people resorted to. You see, medieval Europe wasn't just hungry, it was fragile. Disease hit crops. Army raids burned fields. Harsh winters froze livestock. Insects swarmed and devoured harvests. One disaster could turn a thriving village into a starving one in a matter of weeks. Peasants developed a kind of survival creativity, a grim ingenuity that pushed them to look at the world differently. A rat wasn't a pest, it was protein. A snail wasn't slimy, it was edible. A stagnant pond wasn't dirty, it was full of potential food. And the strangest part, they adapted. Their palates changed. What started as desperation sometimes turned into tradition. Certain foods that started as famine solutions became delicacies. Others became culturally accepted staples. Some even survived into the modern age, but in far more polished, civilized forms. Still, before we dive into the bizarre foods themselves, the rats, the tree bark bread, the fermented things buried in pits for months, it's important to understand one thing. Medieval people didn't eat strange things because they were strange. They ate them because that's what survival demanded. Imagine the scene. A villager watching the last of the grain turn moldy in the sack and deciding whether to risk eating it anyway. These moments weren't rare. They were the backdrop of medieval life. And once you understand that, the strange foods that follow don't seem ridiculous. They become human. They become symbols of resilience, fear, and ingenuity, because hunger is the great equalizer. When you're starving, you don't ask, "Is this normal to eat?" You ask, "Will this keep me alive?" And that's where the story of medieval food gets truly fascinating. If people were forced to eat whatever they could find, then what exactly did they turn to when hunger reached its peak? Chapter 2. Creatures of Necessity. rats, frogs, and anything that moved. If Chapter 1 showed us how medieval hunger pushed people to the edge, then Chapter 2 is where they stepped over it, into a world where the definition of food stretched far beyond what any of us would recognize today. Because when fields were empty and the grain bins echoed like hollow drums, medieval people didn't look for meals. They looked for movement, another day alive, or another family lost to famine. Let's start with the most infamous survivor's meal of all, rats, the emergency meat of medieval Europe. To us, rats are the nightmare of city streets, disease carriers, garbage dwellers, the last thing we would ever consider eating. But in the Middle Ages, rats were protein on legs. During sieges, when armies surrounded a city and blocked all supplies, rats weren't just eaten, they were hunted. A roasted rat might be the only meat someone tasted for weeks. And strange as it sounds, people actually described the taste. Some medieval accounts claim rat meat was sweet, like young rabbit, especially if the rat had been eating grains. Others weren't so lucky. Urban rats living off sewage were tougher, bitter, and sometimes the last thing people resorted to before death. Imagine sitting in the dark corner of a besieged town, trembling with cold, holding a stick over a fire, slowly turning the tiny body of a rat as if it were a feast. Because in that moment, it was. Frogs. The medieval swamp snack. Today we joke about the French eating frog legs, but the truth is much older and much more universal. Medieval peasants across Europe, France, England, Germany, Poland, ate frogs long before cookbooks made it fashionable. Frogs were easy to catch, especially during rainy periods. Children often caught them by hand or with baskets, bringing home dozens at a time. A village mother might sit beside a bucket of wriggling frogs, pulling them out one by one, removing the legs, tossing them into a pan with whatever herbs she had managed to grow. Even monks ate frogs. In fact, some monasteries classified frogs as not technically meat, which meant they were allowed during fasting seasons. So monks became quite skilled at catching them, especially near monastery ponds. To a starving medieval villager, frog legs weren't a delicacy, they were a miracle from the swamp. Snails. The slow-moving survival food. If you've ever seen snails sliding along garden walls, you probably didn't think, "Ah yes, dinner." But medieval Europeans absolutely did. Snails were incredibly valuable as survival food because they were free, plentiful, protein-rich, easy to catch, and importantly, allowed during religious fasting. Medieval scholars even recommended them as healthy for weak stomachs. So during hard times, villagers collected snails by the hundreds. They fed them clean herbs for a few days to purge them, then boiled, fried, or stewed them. Picture a starving family sitting around a pot of bubbling snail stew, a dish that today would be served in high-end restaurants as escargot, but back then was simply the cheapest protein available. Insects. The tiny protein. Nobody talked about. While not widely written about, insects absolutely found their way into medieval diets, especially during famines. Locusts, ants, beetles, crickets, anything abundant and edible. When you're starving, crunchiness takes on a new meaning. One medieval herbal manual even described a recipe using ground beetles mixed into dough to add strength. It wasn't delicious, but it kept people alive, and that was the only standard that mattered. Birds of opportunity. Whatever could be caught. Medieval hunters didn't have firearms. They had nets, traps, and sometimes slings. Crows, pigeons, sparrows, swallows. If it had wings, it had value. Young boys often climbed trees to steal eggs. In some villages, egg hunting was so essential that families marked certain trees as belonging to them. Bird eggs were miniature miracles, pockets of protein that didn't require feeding or tending. Hedgehogs. Yes, really. It might sound adorable, but hedgehogs appeared in medieval recipe collections surprisingly often. They were roasted after removing the spines, and sometimes wrapped in clay so that when the clay hardened and cracked open, the spines came off with the shell. For peasants, hedgehogs were quiet, easy to catch. To modern ears it sounds wild. To medieval families it was Tuesday, stray dogs and cats, the last resort. This one is dark. When you read these accounts, it becomes painfully clear. Medieval people were fighting not just hunger, but hopelessness. The reality of anything that moved. It wasn't about taste, so the question becomes, what happens when the only food left is spoiled, rotten, or decaying? And you have to eat it anyway? That's where Chapter 3 takes us, into the world of rot, fermentation, and survival. Chapter 3. Rot, Ferment, and Survival. Foods that were already off. When eaten. If Chapter 2 showed us how medieval people ate anything that moved, Chapter 3 dives into something even more unsettling. The foods that didn't move at all, because they were already spoiled, rotting, fermenting, or half-decayed by the time anyone touched them. Today, if milk smells sour or meat looks grey, we toss it out without hesitation. But medieval people didn't have that luxury. Food preservation was primitive, storage was unreliable, and hunger was always just one bad season away. So instead of asking, "Is this fresh?" they asked a far more practical question. Can this still keep us alive? And so began the era of eating things that modern stomachs wouldn't dare attempt. The kingdom of rot, when spoilage wasn't the end, but food was precious. Too precious to waste. So medieval people developed an attitude we might call practical bravery. If something didn't smell too deadly and hadn't changed color in a way that screamed danger, it remained edible. Sometimes, rot even became part of tradition. Let's begin with something truly shocking. Rescue meat. Eating what we'd throw away today. In villages far from trade routes, meat was rare. Most families slaughtered animals only once a year, usually during winter. So people created something known in chronicles as rescue meat. This was meat that had discolored, softened, started to smell, or shown the first fuzz of mold, yet it wasn't thrown out. Instead, it was boiled and reboiled, and boiled again. The pot did the rescuing. Boiling meat for hours was believed to drive out the rot and restore purity. Sometimes people added vinegar or strong herbs to mask the smell. Imagine sitting at a wooden table, eating a stew with a slightly sour, rubbery taste, knowing it was your only source of protein for the entire week. And the craziest part? Fermented fish, the medieval version of rot on purpose. Let's be honest, fermented fish is already an acquired taste today, but medieval fermentation, that was a different world. In Scandinavia, people buried fish in the ground inside pits lined with birch bark. They left it there for weeks or months, letting bacteria soften it until it reached a fragrant state. Then they dug it up and ate it. This wasn't a delicacy, it was survival. During long winters, protein from fermented fish kept villages going. And while the smell was strong enough to make visitors gag, locals described it as warming to the body, something that gave strength when the sun disappeared for months. In Iceland, a similar tradition existed with fish and even shark meat. Symptoms of mold poisoning were common: shaking, hallucinations, vomiting. Entire villages experienced strange outbreaks. Some historians even believe certain demonic possession cases were actually mold poisoning from bad bread. But when hunger threatened, people didn't have a choice. A moldy loaf was still a loaf, stinking cheeses and curdled milk. When dairy went rogue, milk spoiled quickly, especially in summer. Without refrigeration, it went sour in a matter of hours. Medieval people didn't panic. Sour milk was normal. In fact, they considered fresh milk harder to digest. So spoiled milk became cheese, buttermilk. In sour cream cheese, especially, took on wild flavors. Some grew thick rinds of mold. Others were intentionally left to ripen until they nearly walked off the table on their own. Monasteries famously produced stinky cheeses, some of which survived into modern recipes. What began as a survival technique eventually became gourmet tradition. But not all dairy survival stories are so harmless. Corrupt butter, the slippery gamble. Medieval butter spoiled fast. It turned rancid, sour, sometimes even worm-infested. Did they throw it away? Not a chance. Rancid butter was so common that medieval cookbooks casually mentioned how to restore its flavor, implying that nobody had the luxury of discarding it. Imagine spreading slightly sour, gritty butter on a loaf of heavy rye bread, knowing fresh butter might not return for months. Nothing was wasted, not even bad booze. Why people risked rotten food. And that's where Chapter 4 takes us. The desperate breads people baked when real flour ran out. Chapter 4. Desperate bread. The strange things they baked into their loaves. Bread wasn't just food in the Middle Ages. It was survival itself. For peasants, bread made up nearly 60–80% of their total diet. So when grain ran short, desperation didn't just creep into the kitchen. It hit like a hammer. Imagine a winter morning. The grain sack is nearly empty. Your children are hungry, and the snow outside tells you there will be no fresh food for months. It was in moments like this that medieval people created desperate breads, the strange and sometimes dangerous substitutes they used when flour ran out. This chapter is about those loaves, the ones that weren't meant to taste good, weren't meant to last long, and weren't meant to impress anyone. The legend of famine bread, loaves born from disaster. Whenever famine struck, and it struck often, millers and bakers had to make flour stretch. They mixed anything and everything into dough. Some additions were edible, others were barely digestible, but all of them were the medieval equivalent of make it work. Let's break down the strangest ones. Bark bread. Yes, real tree bark. It sounds impossible today, but medieval bark bread was a real and widespread famine food. Families stripped the inner bark from birch, elm, pine, or spruce trees. This layer, soft and pale, was dried, ground into powder, and mixed with whatever flour they had left. Tree bark had almost no nutritional value. It didn't provide strength, it didn't taste good, but it filled the stomach. Imagine chewing a slice of bark bread. It's dense, fibrous, bitter, and extremely dry. You'd need ale or water just to swallow it. Yet during the Great Famine, thousands survived on nothing else. In fact, some regions became so dependent on bark bread that local forests were stripped bare. People weren't cutting trees for wood, they were cutting them for food, moss and lichens, bread from the forest floor. When even bark ran short, medieval people turned to something stranger, ground moss and lichens. These weren't the lush, leafy mosses you might picture in a fantasy forest. These were brittle, chalky lichens scraped off rocks and tree trunks. After soaking to remove bitterness, they were dried, crushed, and mixed into dough. The result? A greyish loaf with a chemical taste and a texture like chewing cloth. Some lichens caused stomach pain, others caused vomiting. But for people who hadn't eaten in days, those risks were acceptable. Chroniclers describe families kneeling on frozen ground, scraping rocks bare with knives, gathering anything that could be turned into bread. This wasn't creativity. It was survival instinct, sharpened by starvation. Phantom flour, the art of pretending bread. Was bread millers became accidental magicians. To stretch flour they added finely ground straw, powdered pea shells, dried leaves. These ingredients didn't nourish, but they created the illusion of proper bread. As long as the loaf held together, people accepted it. Acorn flour was common but harsh. It required days of soaking to remove toxins, yet many peasants skipped that step out of desperation. The bread that followed was bitter, heavy, and difficult to digest. So why eat it? Because hunger doesn't negotiate. Bone bread, nutrition from death itself. This is one of the darkest survival foods in medieval history. Grinding bones was time-consuming and emotionally difficult. Imagine a mother, standing over a stone grinder, crushing bones from animals her family once relied on or loved, were pushed. Clay bread, a last resort. No one wanted. This one seems unbelievable, but famine documentation across Europe mentions clay or earth bread. People mixed edible clays or chalky soil into their dough to make it heavier and more filling. It provided no nutrition and often caused constipation or illness. But it bought time. That was the currency of famine. Why eat these things? Because medieval life had one brutal rule. You eat what you have, not what you want. A modern person might gag at the idea of bark bread or lichen loaves. But for medieval families, these foods meant surviving winter long enough to greet spring. These breads weren't symbols of poverty, they were symbols of resilience. The farmer who went into the forest praying he'd find enough moss to keep his family alive. Bread wasn't just bread, it was a lifeline. Because when the forests ran out of bark, and the fields gave no grain, and the world seemed to be starving all at once. People turned to the rivers, swamps, and seas. So in Chapter 5, we dive into the wet, murky world of eels, lampreys, seaweed, swamp vegetables, and water creatures that kept medieval people alive when the land failed them. Chapter 5. Sea monsters and swamp harvests, the bizarre things taken from water. When the land failed, when crops withered, when forests were stripped bare of bark and moss, medieval people turned their eyes to the place that never ran out of mystery. The water, rivers, swamps, lakes, and oceans became lifelines. Vast, unpredictable worlds full of creatures that looked more like monsters than meals. But desperation has a way of transforming fear into courage. And so, across Europe, people who had never tasted seafood in their lives waded into murky waters to drag out anything that slithered, wriggled, or pulsed. Some of these water foods were nutritious. Some were incredibly risky. And some were so strange that even medieval chroniclers described them with a mix of awe and disgust. This chapter takes us into that world, the wet, cold frontier of medieval survival. EELs, the lifesavers of medieval Europe. If there was one creature that truly saved lives during food shortages, it was the eel. To modern people, eels look like something you'd avoid touching, let alone eating. But to medieval villagers, eels were a miracle. They were abundant, easy to catch, rich in fat and protein, available year-round. Imagine a cold, hungry winter, everything frozen solid except the slow-moving water under a sheet of ice. People broke the ice, dropped baskets into the dark water, and pulled out piles of slimy, wriggling survival. Eels were stewed, roasted, smoked, or dried. In some years, entire villages survived almost entirely on eel meat. Even monasteries relied on them, monk records show. Thousands of eels stored for winter meals. So while they looked strange, they were lifesavers. And then came the eel's famous cousin, lampreys, the medieval monster on the plate. Kings loved lamprey pies. Nobles demanded them for feasts. Even during famines, lampreys fetched high prices because they were considered rich, luxurious, and warming. Ironically, the poor also depended on lampreys, but not by choice. When all other fish disappeared, lampreys often remained. Lampreys offered dense calories, and while their appearance terrified children, their flavor, rich and oily, kept families going. But the waters offered far stranger things than these eel-like creatures. Jellyfish, a slimy solution. No one talks about. Did medieval Europeans eat jellyfish? Surprisingly, yes. Coastal communities, especially around the Mediterranean, occasionally harvested jellyfish during desperate times. They weren't a primary food, but a survival fallback. After boiling, jellyfish turned into thin, translucent strips, almost tasteless but filling. They were mixed into stews, added to pottages, or eaten with sour herbs to mask the texture. Imagine chewing something that feels like a cold, rubbery ribbon and being grateful for it. That was the medieval jellyfish experience. Seaweed and algae, Europe's forgotten famine. Crop today, seaweed is considered healthy and trendy. When crops failed, villagers along rocky coasts gathered seaweed in huge piles. They dried it, chopped it, and added it to bread and soups. Some regions even boiled seaweed into a jelly-like paste and used it as a thickener. Coastal monks wrote about seaweed as a blessing during barren years, and in some places it became the backbone of winter meals. And to think what we now call superfoods were once the foods of desperation. Swamp plants, edible, dangerous, and mysterious. Swamps are places most people avoid. They're muddy, mosquito-filled, and full of plants that look suspiciously poisonous. But to medieval survivors, swamps were treasure chests. Families waded into knee-deep muck to gather. Cattail roots, water chestnuts, bulrush shoots. Cattails especially were lifesavers. Their roots could be roasted, ground into flour, or boiled into a thick porridge. Villagers called them the swamp's gift. But not every swamp plant was safe. Some looked edible but caused dizziness or vomiting. Frogs, crayfish, and water insects, protein in the mud. We already visited frogs in Chapter 2, but in wetlands they were harvested on a massive scale. As for water insects, well, hunger makes you reconsider many things. They weren't glamorous, but they were rich in fats and protein. Again, the mindset wasn't, is this delicious? It was, will this keep us alive until spring? Fish heads, spines, and guts, nothing wasted. When fishermen brought back catches, wealthy buyers chose the best cuts. Fish head soup became a staple in famine regions. That's where Chapter 6 takes us, the final chapter, where the story comes full circle and the deeper meaning of these strange medieval foods is finally revealed. Chapter 6, The Disappearing Foods. Why medieval survival meals vanished. By now, you've walked through forests, swamps, icy rivers, and king's feasting halls. You've watched medieval people chew bark, dig up roots, roast frogs, boil moss, and swallow things most modern humans wouldn't go near. But here's the final question, one that echoes across history. If these foods saved so many lives, why did they disappear? These were reminders of desperation, fear, and the constant shadow of death. Once life improved, people didn't celebrate the foods that kept them alive. They buried them. Who still ate poor man's food? Imagine a grandmother telling her grandchildren, we used to survive on moss soup. The second reason. Agriculture revolutionized everything. Another reason famine foods vanished is simple. Food became more reliable. By the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance, Europe changed dramatically. New farming techniques emerged, crop rotation, irrigation channels. These innovations increased yield so much that common people could rely on more consistent harvests. New trade routes opened, spices from India, rice from the Mediterranean, sugar from the Canary Islands. Herring and salted fish traded between nations. Food wasn't just local anymore. It moved across borders, across oceans, and across economies. People didn't need swamp plants or frog legs as everyday meals. They had wheat, barley, oats, and eventually, potatoes and maize after the Columbian Exchange. As stable agriculture spread, survival foods went from necessities to curiosities. Some became peasant dishes, eaten only in remote villages. Others vanished completely. A few transformed into delicacies, like lampreys, oysters, and crayfish. But most simply faded from kitchens. The third reason, religion and culture changed eating habits. Christian Europe had strict fasting rules for centuries. During fast days, meat was banned, but fish, frogs, and beavers were allowed. This is why frogs became so common in medieval France. It's why lampreys became prized. It's why eels turned into a staple. But during the Reformation, many regions broke away from Catholic fasting laws. Suddenly, the pressure to eat fish vanished. People didn't need to rely on water meat anymore. They could eat beef, pork, chicken, foods that were once banned half the year. The cultural meaning of food shifted. What was once religiously important became optional, and many watery famine foods slipped into obscurity. The fourth reason, urbanization changed tastes. As towns grew into cities, diets changed dramatically. Cities didn't have forests full of roots and edible moss. They didn't have muddy ponds full of frogs. They certainly didn't have marshlands offering cattail roots. Instead, they had bakeries, butchers, markets, imported goods, preserved foods. Urban people looked down on rural survival cuisine. They called it primitive, rustic, or unclean. And because cities shaped culture, books, stories, recipes, urban tastes became the standard. By the time printing presses spread across Europe, survival foods were almost completely absent from cookbooks. Only elite recipes were written down, which meant frog stew, bark bread, moss broth, snail soup, and wild swamp roots disappeared from recorded history.